We had a really good question come up last night in the free webinar about how to make a good complaint. And essentially, I'd shared some figures from Bedford Borough Council about how many people were in, or how many households were in temporary accommodation through Bedford Borough Council's kind of housing duties. And the question came in, how do you get these figures? And it's important because those figures show the impact we've had in terms of, how making complaints has led to an increase of temporary accommodation capacity in the borough. And so, it's something that I'd say, if you're serious about getting your council to behave themselves, it's a question that everyone should ask, really. Get those annual figures of the number of people in TA on a given night, and so you can kind of look at the trend of it, because over the average of England is this is kind of gradual increase, but you'll have some councils that it's just kind of flatlining, or it might even be going down, as opposed to councils like Bedford where it's sextupled, it's through the roof. So it kind of helps you understand the bigger picture, and ultimately whether your kind of efforts to kind of get the council to act lawfully are kind of coming to fruition. So there's a few I'll go through the kind of couple of things you need to know about making them, but then I'll talk about how we've used their FOIs to kind of have an impact, and just kind of hopefully show just how powerful they can be. So in terms of the limitations, you've got to make the request in writing. So ideally, if you search for freedom of information and your local council name, it will take you through to their FOI department or their data protection department or whatever. And it will have instructions of what you need to do. So I think you need to give your name, and I think that's it really. So you need to give your name, and then you need to ask your questions. You can't just kind of ask for a limitless amount of information. It has to be possible for the council to respond to the request with, I think, something like 18 man hours worth of work to kind of respond. So, it might be, and we've done this before, where the council were only able to kind of give some of the figures we asked for. So we kind of waited 60 days and then made another request. So you can kind of make as many requests as you want to, provided it's not within 60 days. And another thing to say about that story is that if the council comes back to you and says, oh, it's going to take too long to find these figures out, they have to suggest to you how you can refine your search. So some of the kind of FOIs we've made has been for a whole year's worth of stats. What they should do and what they didn't do in one case, they should come back to you and say, look, we haven't got the man hours to kind of find out the stats for the whole year, but we can give you, X number of days worth of data. That's kind of how it should work. So again, don't just kind of give up if the council's initial response is to say they haven't got it or they can't give it. Just push through. I've made complaints about failures to kind of adhere to the FOI process. So, as I say, it shouldn't be difficult. It should be bread and butter for the council really to respond. And in terms of anything else you need to know about the process, they've got 20 working days to respond, unless it's particularly complicated, in which case they can kind of get a 20-day extension. And it may well be that when you ask that initial question, they want to come back to you and to kind of clarify what that means. So the time starts ticking when they have all the information they need to go and respond to that request. So it really is that simple. It shouldn't be controversial. It should be straightforward, and you can get a huge amount of information through the process that helps you kind of analyze what's really going on, what impact is kind of are you having, and you can kind of amalgamate it with other data that's publicly available. So for example, if you Google key performance indicators, homelessness, government website, something like that, you'll kind of get the kind of these massive live tables of data from all councils around the country. So it will have like loads of information. You can kind of trawl through it. But there will be times where you need to kind of specifically request FOI stuff because it's not included in those tables. But as I say, you can kind of like cross-reference it with things that are happening elsewhere. So yeah, that's the kind of the stuff that's on paper. In terms of how we've used it, and I'll give you a couple of examples, but I've lost count of how many FOI requests we've made. So a few years ago, I think it was 2017, something like that, we basically made an FOI request asking the council for how many people approached the housing option services, or how many households approached the housing option service stating that they were fleeing abuse, how many dash forms were completed by housing option staff, and how many adult safeguarding alerts were made. Now the stats came back: 135 households approached the council citing domestic abuse as being the reason for them approaching them, or words to that effect. Now, under the adult multi-agency safeguarding policy, You would expect, therefore, to each of those households to be referred to the safeguarding team through the safeguarding kind of form, because that's essentially what the policy says. You'd also expect a kind of significant number to kind of result in having dash forms completed or completed with them or whatever, so that they can potentially go to MARAC, because these are going to be the most serious cases. And, you know, that 135 households would not include people who are vulnerable for other reasons. So people who are being abused where it wasn't domestic abuse, it was kind of, you know, other things going on. So, you know, you would expect there to be at least like 150, 200, 250, maybe even 300 safeguarding alerts to be raised for the whole of that year. And the FOI came back and it said there was 0. So basically, you know, so literally that was immediately should have been, well, it would have been a ringing alarm bells for the chief, the kind of head of service and whatever, because they have a policy which is like, you know, unambiguously saying that, you know, if someone is reporting abuse to you, you need to do something about it immediately, which involves referring it to the safeguarding team. And yet there was this kind of complete, I mean, 0 is crazy. The fact that not a single housing officer had raised a safeguarding concern for the whole of that year was nuts. And so we didn't, and the number of dash forms completed was 4. So we didn't explicitly do anything with this data. We kind of referenced it in the domestic abuse report we did. I think we kind of threw it into a few questions with the housing committee, with conversations with councillors. But basically that's kind of all we did, because it was so outrageous that literally 0 safeguarding referrals had been made. Clearly the management went away and kind of rejigged things and kind of presumably put their staff on training and, you know, did whatever they needed to do to get that number up. So as of 2021, the figure's something like 200. We haven't got the exact figure, but that's, you know, that's reasonable. I mean, I think it probably should be a bit higher, but I think 200 is certainly in the ballpark of what it should be. And it might seem really pedantic and kind of, well, you know, safeguarding alerts don't really do anything anyway, which is true some of the time. But crucially, when a housing officer is considering someone's approach for housing assistance, a lot of the time, risk of abuse, previous abuse is going to be very, very relevant to whether they're homeless and whether they're in priority need, and potentially whether they're intentionally homeless, and also local connection. So it kind of covers, you know, 4 of the 5, technically 5, actually, I won't go into that. So it kind of covers a huge amount of stuff that the housing officer needs to know. Now, if you've got a situation where people are coming in and reporting they're being abused and the housing officer doesn't do anything with that, that means it's very easy for the housing officer to sweep things under the carpet. You know, you can't make a safeguarding alert to the safeguarding team without admitting that there is possible that this person is being abused and therefore, you know, may be in priority needs. So it feeds back into that kind of section 188 duty to provide temporary accommodation and kind of the subsequent duties. So it's really kind of, it's a really cool, kind of really powerful, ended up being a very powerful FOI request, simply because, you know, the council was doing so badly at it at the point. And we weren't kind of blindly asking for figures. We knew that this was going to be an issue. We had some really serious upheld complaints that year. And so it kind of, you know, we weren't going in blind to it. We were being quite tactical about it. So that's one example. Now, another example, as I say, there's a whole load I could choose from here, but another example is kind of quite different. I want to say last year, I can't remember now, maybe 2020. We did an FOI request, we requested loads of stuff, but one of the questions we asked was, what was the average housing officer caseload in 2017, I think we said, so before the HRA kicked in, and what is the average caseload now? Now, again, this wasn't like, you know, this wasn't just a random question. It was because we could see that housing officers were just genuinely struggling to do kind of the things that they needed to do. And plus, bear in mind that with the HRA, you've got these additional duties to do a personalised housing plan. You've got to do these extra kind of letters and stuff like that. So the workload had basically increased. And the FOI figures that came back were not exact, but basically what they said was the average caseload in 2017 was something like 20 to 25 clients. And in 2020, I'm going to say, it might be 2021, it was about 55 to 60, which, you know, again, we kind of then used that figure to kind of ask a question in the housing committee and said, hey, you know, how are you ensuring your housing officers have the resources to do their job, you know, are properly supported to deal with these difficult situations they have? And again, you know, it's difficult to know exactly what impact that had, but clearly they were listening. You know, there was some follow-up questions from other councillors, and it was clearly a question which kind of struck people as being quite significant, that essentially client caseloads had more than doubled, potentially tripled, whilst there was a lot more work to do. So, because the other thing that kind of changed was that now housing officers had to do housing register applications as well. There used to be a team that did it. Now it's just kind of relying on them. I would hope that that fed into increasing resources and support for housing staff. I haven't got any concrete figures yet whether it did or not, but I think, I don't think it did any harm, let's put it that way. Certainly the question was welcomed by the housing officers, who were like sitting there thinking, we're getting buried in paperwork and we just can't do what we need to do. So as I say, there's a whole load of other things we did, other FOIs. Some of the FOIs have resulted in a long, kind of chasing process. I remember one, we were asking essentially how many people approached the council and gave the council reason to believe they might be homeless, thus triggering Section 184, and how many Section 184 kind of triggers were actually accepted, and the number was kind of significantly lower. But again, with that question, one of the managers involved with it was really kind of obstructive. Ended up having to speak to some guy in the legal team to explain what the question was I was trying to ask, because they knew full well what I was trying to ask, but they kind of, they were like dithering around, and ultimately did get some figures back. I can't remember what they were, but it was, it was significantly lower than it should have been. So again, the FOI was essentially evidence that there was a systemic problem with people approaching the council, asking for help, giving them reasons to believe they might be homeless, and they were not treated under Section 184. So, and this was a period where there'd been some very serious complaints about exactly that issue. So it wasn't like the council, because I think the council did try and say, oh, well, it made no difference to them. It was nonsense. It clearly made a very big difference to at least some of the people we knew. So yeah, that's FOIs. Plenty of stuff on Google if you just Google it as well. Put a question in the chat if you want to, or in the comments about FOI processes. Again, I'm going to sound like a broken record. Please do subscribe to this channel. If you find it useful, please do like the video. We run the Better Homelessness Practice group on Facebook, which is a really good place just to ask anonymized questions. So hopefully that will be something that you might be interested in. And we're going to be doing, or we're certainly hoping to do, these regular free webinars about a particular topic. So topics that we're planning to do at the moment, things like rights of a tenant, things like how does the democratic process work. So we're hoping to get a couple of councillors and kind of explaining, what do all these committees do? What does it mean to kind of involve a councillor in your case? All that kind of stuff. So that's kind of, a few examples, but there's going to be many more. But yeah, other than that, please do stay in touch. As I say, hopefully this stuff is interesting. I'm almost thinking that we, at Just Us, me and my colleagues, we need to kind of come up with like a recipe of all the things that we did that was effective. Because what I'm aware of, as I think I said earlier, was that, solicitors tend to be kind of quite narrow. They kind of, they treat everything as if you've got to go through the court and go through the appeal process and so on. And that's awesome, don't get me wrong. But there's this kind of, there's these other avenues which could be gone down, like FOIs, like making complaints, all that kind of stuff, which I don't think the legal sector really kind of has explored fully. And equally, you get people like community groups, which are doing an awesome job kind of, getting alliances going on to challenge systemic issues, but they're kind of, they're lacking in that kind of real kind of statistical kind of bedrock of, understanding issues. So again, FOIs can be brilliant for that. So yeah, hopefully that's all cool. Check out the next video, be up soon.